I'm probably saying it wrong, but it's like how to respond to Protestants using the church fathers. And so one of the things that he came up with, and I forget if this was Jimmy Akins or some other person, but anyway, he gave 4 rules for reading the church fathers. Rule number 1, check your sources. Make sure that the saints are saying what the saints are saying, was basically that. Because a lot of people like to say, well, the church fathers believe this. And it's like, really? Well, give me a source. Where's that source? I mean, this is how I investigated the church. When I read the Catholic sources that I did and they were quoting the church fathers, I didn't trust them. I went to the library and I pulled out the volume because they're written like the Bible. They tell you what book, what chapter, and what verse each of the fathers is. So I went in and I could find it, and then I could read the context, not just the quote, but what was said around it, which is always a good rule of interpretation. That's why you never take one verse of the Bible out and say, well, the Bible says this and that's that. You have to understand what is the context in which it's being said. You can make the Bible say anything you want it to say if you take it out of context. Scott Hahn puts it this way: a text out of context is a pretext. And I think that that's a succinct way of biblical interpretation. You can literally have the Bible say anything you want, but if you put it in proper context, it generally never says what the person is saying. So the same thing with the church fathers. You can get anyone to say anything you want, but you have to put it in proper context. The second rule, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because the fathers don't say, Mary's Assumption occurred here, doesn't mean that they didn't believe in Mary's Assumption. Okay? Just because they don't use the word Trinity, doesn't mean they didn't believe in the Trinity. Okay? The fact that no one talks about, I don't know, pick some sort of topic in some of the earliest documents, doesn't mean they didn't believe it, it's just that it wasn't brought up. Like the word Mass. No one uses the term Mass to describe the Christian liturgy. In fact, it's called the liturgy by the early fathers. So you say, well, they don't celebrate the Mass, it's not, the word's not even used. Oh, well, did they describe what we would call the Mass? Well, then they believed in the Mass. You see what I mean? So absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means that they probably didn't have the theological words for it. Rule number 3, I love this one. Scriptural sufficiency does not mean you're sola scriptura. This is a big deal among Bible Protestants nowadays, especially evangelicals. Because of the rise of Catholic answers and Catholic apologists, quoting the church fathers, supporting early Catholic beliefs, Protestants have gotten into the fathers themselves to show that they're just misusing the fathers. And so they pull out all of these quotes that sound really good. It sounds like the early fathers believed, oh, only we need the Bible in order to follow. And it's like, they sound very convincing. But when you look again at the context, they're talking about the material sufficiency of the scriptures. Okay? And that doesn't mean it's our only rule of faith. So don't mix up the terms. Okay? Because these same fathers honored the Pope, believed in confession, had believed in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, prayed to Mary, believed in her Immaculate Conception, and so on. So it's like, don't tell me that they were sola scriptura or proto-Protestants, because that's the way that evangelicals have been starting to utilize the fathers. Okay? So it's something that you have to be aware of. Rule number 4, provisional lists do not mean solemn canons. So, particularly in lists of Bible books, if you go into the earliest of the fathers, some of them don't list all of the books that we have in our current Bible. So a lot of Protestants will look at it and say, see, they didn't believe in some of the books of the Bible that you have, so you're wrong. Well, these aren't solemn pronouncements of the church. These are just provisional lists. As time went on, when it came time to solidify what we came to know as the canon of scriptures, the canon that you see right here is the canon that they agreed upon. And that goes all the way back to the 4th century. One could argue it goes all the way back into the 2nd century with Irenaeus, who gives us, he is the first theologian to say we have 4 gospels. There were other heretics that said we had 1, maybe 2. He's the first one to say you read 4 gospels. Just like there are 4 corners of the earth, just because there's 4 corners in a square, because there are 4 cherubim around the throne, we have 4 gospels. This is some of the reasoning that he used. Okay? That moved forward. And so we end up with 4 gospels. But prior to that, there were others that would contend we only have 1. Marcion was one of these heretics who believed that we needed to completely break away from Judaism. So he completely rejected the Gospel of Matthew because it's too Jewish. He said the only gospel that we should read is Luke. Well, no. We need all 4 witnesses. Okay? So provisional list doesn't equal solemn canons. And those are just some of the terms they use. Again, marvelous session. Marvelous session. I really liked it. Jimmy Akins was there talking about his new website, Jimmy Akins' Mysterious World, and talked about conspiracies. I got his his CD set on ghosts, Antichrist, and lost tribes. Very well done. He's got a brilliant mind for rational thinking. I really come to respect a lot of what Jimmy Akins says. So if you get his podcast, you can hear a very well-balanced Catholic perspective on some of these issues. Then the one that it was Monsignor, it was one of the priests. I can't remember who, but he was the one that talked about, it was the very last session, and it had to do with our relationship with God, our salvation, Jesus' ongoing incarnation. So I took some of these slides. You will not certainly die, God knows well. When you eat of it, you will be open, and you will be like gods who know good and evil. The irony is that Adam and Eve were already like God. Before that, this was a complete lie of the devil. Okay? And he went on and spoke about what is written in the Catechism of the Church, one of the most profound paragraphs in the canon of the Catechism. The Word became flesh to make us partakers of the divine nature. That comes from 2 Peter. For this is why the Word became man, and the Son of God became the Son of Man, so that man, by entering into communion with the Word, and thus receiving divine adoption, might become sons or daughters of God. That's Saint Irenaeus. Irenaeus came up a lot when you talk about the early fathers. You can't get around him. He was such a brilliant mind in compiling the early beliefs.
Did you sneak him in, or did they just refer to him?
Oh, no, he was pretty prominent throughout it all. Next part. For the Son of God became man, that we might become God. That's St. Athanasius. The only begotten Son of God wanting to make us sharers in his divinity, assumed our nature, so that he, made man, might make men gods. And that was St. Thomas Aquinas. So you see this thought, this idea goes all the way from Peter to Irenaeus to Athanasius to Thomas. This is a consistent theme in our understanding of the role of salvation. That God is and has been attempting to elevate us out of our animal nature, if you will, to make us sons and daughters of God, to make us like He is, to become sharers of His divinity, like He became sharers in our humanity. It's a switch. Okay? What this doesn't mean is Mormonism. Okay? That's very clear. Mormons believe that humans turn into gods, sort of like the Greek gods. You know, all-powerful beings ruling over planets of their own spiritual children that they've created. Okay? No, that's not it. We become partakers of divine nature. We become like Jesus is by nature. We become that by grace. But it is a true transformation of our nature into something divine, a sharer of the divine nature. And this is seen in the Mass. I've mentioned this before, but it's one of the prayers of the Mass. Let me see if I can find it really quick. No, that's too far away. All right. I believe.
The priest was washing his hands.
Yes, it's that part.
To share in his divinity.
Yes, we come to share in his divinity as he humbled himself to share in our humanity. Let me see if I can find it. After the Gloria, after the profession of faith,
After the offering.
Before.
prayers of the faithful. No, where is it? I just saw it in here. I should always put bookmarks in here because. Hold it. Pray. Supper was ended.
I think it's before the offering.
Here is it. The Savior's command.
Wash away my
Breaking of the bread.
Away my iniquity.
I'm sorry? Yes. I mean, I'm alluding to it. I want to give the right. Hold on. Oh, darn. Well, it is that prayer when he says, Lord, by the mixture of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. That's said in every Mass. So when we partake in the Eucharist, we are partaking in the divine nature, in the hopes or it's a hope, but it's also a reality that we are elevated out of our merely humanness into a share of God's life. And that's what we are talking about. Okay, one quick, and then I'm going to move on. By the way, this is one of the gifts that I got at the conference, extra Magnificats for October. So you'll all be getting some of these. So like I said, I came bearing gifts, lots of them. 2 bags full. Well, most of them.
Early Santa
Yeah,
Claus.
all right, so I can't find it, so there we are. I love the way that he summarized this. The four main areas of salvation: participation in the divine nature, divine adoption, the great exchange. We give God our sin, he gives us his life and grace. I mean, that's a bargain no matter how you look at it. We give him our sin, he gives us his life and grace. You can't get a better deal than that. That we become gods, meaning we become duplicate Christs or Marys. That's what we're talking about. Jesus is replicated in our lives to the point that he shines through us and they see him, not us. That's what we're talking about. That's a complete transformation of the human soul, from merely human to glorified human. This is what we call a saint. Saints are merely windows by which we see Jesus through the life of this person. We don't see the person, we see Jesus living through them. It's not you don't get memory wiped. You become who you are, but you become fully who you are meant to be in God when this transformation comes. It's a very profound statement, but it's something that we realize when we talk about how Adam and Eve had this prior to their sin. They had this already by nature. They had this, and they let it go. They gave it up. Okay? And as I said earlier, it's not because they fully understood it. I believe it was like a little child. They had a child's level of reason to be able to do that. They didn't fully understand what the ramifications were. Had they would have never done it. Okay? Which is why humans are redeemable and angels are not. Angels, when they fell,